Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better. I'm your host, Tanya de Grunwald, an HR commentator who's watching, listening, and hopefully asking the right questions. Okay, let's get this working. Hi everybody, thanks for joining us today. This is the first episode since the podcast has had a bit of a reboot and a rebrand, so I thought it would be a good idea to reset our focus as well with a broad conversation with Neil Morrison, who's one of the UK's most outspoken and experienced HR professionals, centring on the hot topic of diversity, equity and inclusion, or DEI. Neil is the Group HR Director at Severn Trent, a British water company with around 10,000 employees. He's been there for 7 years now, and before that he was Chief People Officer at Penguin Random House for 9 years and Head of HR at Home Retail Group, which owned Argos and Habitat for 8 years. This is the first part of what I think has turned out to be a fascinating conversation, which I've actually split between 3 episodes, as there's just so much good stuff here. I think you'll agree that it's just so refreshing to hear these topics being discussed so openly. You'll hear that we don't shy away from talking about things like race, disability, trans inclusion, and the Israel-Gaza conflict. So in today's episode, we get into the origins of DEI and how and why Neil thinks organisations drifted away from their original goal of creating more productive workforces. Neil then talks us through the ways in which bad practice within DEI has started to create headaches for organisations internally. So, for example, impacting productivity and retention and leading to too many unpleasant disagreements between colleagues and also time-consuming grievances for HR teams and also their legal advisors to deal with. We also talk about whether politics belongs in the workplace at all. So that's all of what's in today's episode. Then in the next episode, you'll hear Neil's analysis of why we're seeing so many employees winning DEI-related employment tribunals and also whose fault that might be. In addition, we'll get into how staff networks have suffered from mission creep and whether we need better quality control around DEI training sessions. Then in the final episode of the trio, we will talk about why we're seeing some heads of DEI behaving more like activists and whether the UK's DEI industry is set to shrink significantly as organisations seek to make savings during a time of belt tightening and economic uncertainty. Just one more thing before we start. I'm actually working on a project to bring together senior HR professionals who share some of Neil's concerns about where poor practice has crept into DEI work. So I'm really, really keen to hear from people who wish to return to a common sense approach where problems are identified and where open professional conversation is not only permitted but actively encouraged. So if that sounds like you and you'd like to get in touch, please contact me via LinkedIn. Okay, I'm going to stop talking and I will let you enjoy the episode. So this is me with Neil Morrison, the Group HR Director at Severn Trent. Okay, hi Neil, thank you so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you for coming on.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me here.
Well, I've been quite clear with you about why I've got you here today, which is I've basically invited you here to talk mainly about diversity, equity and inclusion, or DEI or EDI or D&I, whatever we seem to be calling it. It seems to move around a little bit. So I really want to get an HR director's view really of what's going on here. From my perspective, and I have talked to quite a lot of people in this world over the last year or so really, and I'm quite active on LinkedIn, as some people will know, I see a mix of views that's developed around DEI, and I think that some people who are really into it see it as maybe an essential mechanism to make the world of work fairer, more inclusive, whatever that word means to them. We can get into what that actually means, and hopefully more productive. That would be a bonus, it almost seems, but it feels to me like it's seen as the sort of conscience of a company, somebody said to me recently, and I thought, ooh, that's interesting. On the other side of it, we've got people who, maybe from outside of DEI and outside of HR indeed, who are beginning to see it as a kind of a political project, which is run by what seem to be kind of activist employees who seem to be pursuing their own agenda, sometimes their political agenda, sometimes their personal agenda, it's not really clear, from within their own organisation that they work for, apparently with very little or no oversight. So I think that's kind of how I'm going to frame this conversation. So there are kind of two camps. A lot of people in the middle who either don't really know what's going on or don't really have any strong views. So we'll get into all of that as we go on. I guess my first question for you is, what do HR directors actually do? Because we don't see you guys very often. They tend to hide you away. What do you do? What's within the remit of your role?
God, 30 years into it, if I said I don't know, I'd be in trouble tonight. So I guess the way I always describe it as what I do is I help people's teams and organisations to perform better. Ultimately, that's what we do. If you think about what are the composite parts of that, it's about making sure people are aligned and they know what you're trying to achieve. It means that you've got the right skills to deliver what you're trying to achieve, that you've got the right number of people in the right organisational structure, and that people are incentivised and rewarded and get feedback based on their performance. So ultimately, that's the kind of continuum that HR directors look after. It's about organisational performance, I think, in the shortest form.
Okay. And how typical do you think you are as an HR director in terms of your scope and your focus and how you work?
So I guess I've been doing this for quite a while. And so probably there's very few of us that have been doing it for the length of time that I've been doing it in the kind of organisations that I've been doing it. And that's not necessarily a reflection of capability or ability, but I think what it does do is it gives you a kind of range of insights into the world of HR and how things are, and maybe a confidence that comes with that in terms of how you look at events, how you look at issues, how you look at organisations, how you have conversations. And so naturally, I mean, if you talk about, FTSE 100 HR directors, well, by definition, there's only 100 of them, right? And if you look at those that have done sort of multiple organisations, there's fewer than that. So, I think, I guess probably not hugely typical in terms of the length of time I've been doing it at the organisations I've worked for. But ultimately, I suppose, that's a factor of age. It's a factor of, as I say, of length of experience as much as it is of any kind of capability or ability.
Okay. And so just to be really clear, what are the reporting lines around you? Who is your boss and then who reports to you?
Yeah, so I report into the CEO. And I would argue that all CHROs, CPOs should report into the CEO. And if they're not...
What was that jargon you just used? CHRO and CPO? Just explain that. Not everybody listening is going to be an HR person. I think I know what this means. But...
Yeah, well, I call myself an HR director, right? Which is it's old school. I'd quite happily be a personnel director, and we'll come on to naming and the importance or not of naming. But lots of people now call themselves chief personnel officers or chief HR officers, along with the chief executive officer and chief financial officer. So it's just a kind of standardisation of
chief people officer. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then beneath me, I've got my learning and development function, my recruitment resourcing function, my operational function, so payroll, employment relations, all of that. And then business partnering, who are, if you like, they're like the GPs within an organisation. They're the people who will interact on a daily basis and feed into some of those other areas. And then specifically in my world, I also have media, comms, press office, and all of that. But that's a kind of separate conversation in a separate world.
Okay, so that part of it, the media comms bit, is not typical, but the rest of it would be typical. So you're looking after things like sort of workforce planning, all the learning and development stuff. You were presumably in charge of all the changes around working from home during COVID, all that sort of stuff as well, were you?
Yeah, I mean, although our organisation was critical national infrastructure, so we were essential service, so there wasn't that much working from home. It was people out in the field and in communities working. But exactly, it's essentially from the moment you think about joining an organisation, so the recruitment, the attraction of that, the onboarding of it, the skills, the development, the pay, pensions, benefits, through to retirement and leaving at the other end of it, all of that and that employee experience and journey sits within the HR function.
Okay, so that's all you. And what percentage of your role is DEI? Presumably, does the head of DEI reports into you? And what percent? Oh, they don't necessarily.
No,
Or they do.
no. One of my direct reports has our diversity lead reporting into them.
Okay, so that person doesn't even report into you. Okay, but DEI always sits under HR, or it sometimes sits under HR. It depends on the organisation.
It mostly sits under HR. I would say in most organisations, that's where it sits. There are a few organisations who've gone with standalone, you know, chief diversity officers or whatever it may be, but the vast majority, I think, you'd see sitting within the HR function.
Okay, and you are responsible for DEI, even if the head of DEI doesn't directly report to you. You are responsible for DEI. Is that correct?
Well, I suppose this is interesting, though, isn't it? Right, because this is general. This is kind of the meat of the conversation. Really, is am I responsible for the organisational compliance with the legislation that sits around diversity? Yes, I am. Am I responsible for how included people feel in my organisation? Well, to a certain extent, but that's a team game, isn't it? So I think yes, if you said there was a functional lead, you'd look to the HR director, you'd look to me. But in the same way that I'm not responsible for culture, I'm also not responsible for diversity and inclusion because so much goes on in different parts of the organisation.
Okay, and that'll be up to different managers and different department heads.
Yeah,
And okay,
exactly.
I see what you mean. Yeah, I see what you mean. Okay, so as I mentioned, I think DEI's harshest critics say that from the outside, it's looking like there's a lot of questions to be answered about what's going in within the organisations. We'll get onto that. What I'd really like to ask you about first is how DEI is going from an HR perspective, from your perspective. And to do that, I want to ask why it was first introduced in the first place in the corporate world. And was it, I don't know how far back, I've been watching it for the last sort of 5 years really closely, 10 years it's been in my rearview mirror. When did all this bring your whole self to work and DEI come in? Did it ever seem like a good idea to you?
So I think this has evolved. As I say, I've been in this game 30 years. So if I go back to, when I was learning, when I was coming in, diversity was essentially about protected characteristics, right? So there's lots of debates about how many, you'd have to report on how many people with a disability you employed. You would potentially have, some gender-based schemes, but you didn't have an enormous amount of kind of, I would say, soft D&I in the way that it's evolved. And I think that, the kind of inclusion debate, which is when a lot of this started to happen, was probably about 20 odd years ago that started to be more at the front. So you had things like the Disability Discrimination Act coming in. You had some changes to Equal Pay and Sex Discrimination and Race Relations Act and bringing that all together in the Equality Act. So that was probably the moment where, it kind of seemingly started on the trajectory I think we're on. But also, there's been certain inflection points that happen. So, Black Lives Matter was an inflection point in the overall kind of journey. So of course it's been around for as long as I've been doing this, but I think its change in form and its change in approach is probably more recent. And I'd say you're probably right. It is probably the last 5 to 10 years. I'd say that's been the direction of travel.
Okay. For me, I've noticed that I would say DEI's toughest critics want to scrap the whole thing completely, to be honest. And you hear people saying things like that they want to return to meritocracy, which maybe I should put in quotes. Does such a thing even exist? Could we return anywhere? The world is completely different. What do we mean by meritocracy? There's always inherent, unfairness within every system. I don't think people that work within HR broadly, or even I don't even know if it's the kind of majority view. I don't think it's that popular to scrap DEI. I don't think HR people want to scrap DEI. I think that's partly because we have been closer to seeing the positive things that have been achieved under what we're now calling DEI, and how the workplace has generally got, I would say, nicer, more welcoming, if we're not going to use a word like inclusive, more mixed. And I think the biggest changes have been noted probably around women, race, social mobility, disability. This is not a perfect situation, but I've been using the phrases good DEI and bad DEI kind of for the last few months, and I think that kind of, for me, that works quite well. Some people say there's no such thing as good DEI, obviously, and I acknowledge that view. But I would say good DEI is what I would say is genuinely inclusive and also legally sound, and has ideally got, good data behind it. And then there's bad DEI, which I think is divisive, legally iffy, and doesn't have any data behind it. Do you agree with those sort of broad categories? Do you agree that there is bad DEI out there?
So I think most people would agree that they want access to work and performance in work to be fair. I think most people would say that. Some people would argue that you do that by having a total, freedom, free market, if you like, and assuming that will mean that the best person gets it. Other people think you've got to engineer it in order to try and create fairness. But ultimately, everyone's trying to achieve, I think, most people are trying to achieve the same thing. Is there bad practice that then comes in order to deliver those end goals? Absolutely, there is. And is there good practice that sits there? Absolutely, there is. But I think it's really important to separate out the intention and the action, because I think when you get into the kind of culture wars around diversity, and you've got people going, it's outrageous and it's brilliant, and ultimately they're forgetting that actually pretty much everyone's trying to achieve the same. What they're complaining about is the means of doing it. So I very much agree with you that I think there's a lot of practice that's come in that I don't think is really grounded in data and in outputs and in measurable outcomes. And I think that can be problematic and can fall into what you might want to call the bad category. And I think there are lots of people who are working incredibly hard, to try and, for example, increase female representation in ExCos, executive committees, and in CEOs, and who are doing lots of really good work on that, where there is measurable improvement and progress over a period of time. So yeah, I think that's right, and I would agree. But I think the intention for most people is the same. It's just how people are going about doing it.
I'm not sure if I agree with you entirely. I think I partly do. I think broadly fairness is the answer, but I think people are starting to think, what do you mean by fairness? Do you mean engineering the makeup of every single company or organisation so that it directly reflects the wider population? Is that what we're doing now? Are we deliberately saying we need this percentage of people from these groups, and if it's anything lower than that, then we're racist, or we're whatever, that something's wrong? What are we going for? I'm not totally sure that we've identified what the goal is here. Do you know what I mean?
So if you flip it on its head and say, do you think the best people should get the best jobs and should progress? I think most people would say yes. Right. Most people would say, you talked about meritocracy earlier, and I agree with your kind of reservations around that, but most people would argue that meritocracy is probably the right answer. Where people differ is some people say that you'll only get a meritocracy by breaking down the structures of society in order to create it, and that's where you get into, I think, what can be seen as almost social policy rather than work practice. Some people believe it's a meritocracy anyway, so you just allow other people anyone to do whatever they want, and if the boardroom's full of white men, that's because white men are the best. And some people, and I think probably the majority, sit in the middle that go, hang on a sec, there's some stuff that gets in the way of this being truly equal. So how do we try and reduce that to allow more people to kind of flourish? And that can be access to work experience, it can be access to education in university, it can be support during caring leave, it can be a whole range of different things. But it becomes less about kind of social policy and trying to reconstruct society and more about what do I do in my organisation to smooth away some of the areas of friction that might prevent me from getting the best people.
I see what you mean. So the devil's in the detail when it comes to what we're actually doing here.
I think that's right. And I think, ultimately what you're doing with, whether you call it EDI, DNI, it really doesn't matter. And actually, I think when you start to rebrand things, you're generally losing a battle when you start to rebrand, because, if you look at any great marketing organisations, they rebrand normally when they've got a problem and they need to do something else. But ultimately what you're trying to do is cultural change within your organisation. Cultural change is about systemic change. And so it has to be about the detail, because you're going in and you're looking through the details of where the system isn't quite working correctly and trying to improve it. And that's a very different skill set to, for example, campaigning about something, which people might do externally outside of an organisation and campaign to try and get change. You do that in a different way to when you're running an organisation and you're trying to make those changes take place.
Okay, great. That's helpful. Thank you. So if we're talking about bad practice, if you don't like my bad DEI label, bad practice, what kind of sort of headaches is that creating for HR directors and for companies kind of from within, if you like? Because we see stuff from the outside, but what's happening from within, from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think ultimately, if you're creating noise in an organisation that isn't connected to ultimately what you're trying to do, whatever that noise is about, but let's say that in this environment it's about D&I, and therefore you've got a kind of noisy debate, whether it's trans rights or whatever it may be, then the time that people have spent thinking about that, talking about that, worrying about it, feeling agitated is ultimately going to affect your kind of productivity, and it's almost like the opposite of what you're trying to achieve through this is to, bring your whole self, feel at peace, feel at ease, and therefore able to contribute. So you've got some issues that come in there that I think, you ultimately affect people's motivations. You've obviously got, the risk of grievances, and I think over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, I've definitely seen a rise in the number of kind of internal issues that relate to D&I matters. And so, that can be quite time consuming. And ultimately, I think, you run the risk that people just don't stay with you. If they think that you are trying to control what they think, what they believe, you're trying to dictate what they can and can't do or can't say, which I think some of those bad practices do, then ultimately people are going to go, this isn't a place for me and I don't want to be part of this. So, as a kind of HR director, if you're about driving performance, then all of those things are a massive issue. And so you've got to be really, really careful about, fine-tuning that system, that organisational system, so that you don't get those negative outcomes.
So in terms of productivity, if we're saying that DEI was brought in, one of the reasons it was brought in was hopefully to increase productivity, and within the private sector that means increasing profit. You wanted to have, the idea was that people would be more engaged, bringing their true selves, authentic, feeling as comfortable as possible in the workplace. That would increase their productivity. What it sounds like you're saying is that we're now seeing either people that are really into this DEI stuff they're spending a lot of time on this stuff apparently, maybe, and people that aren't into it are kind of disengaging a bit if they're not leaving. Is that right?
Yes. So this is coming back to your idea of bad practice, and what I think is, if you're overstretching your remit and starting to not make it about the workplace and performance in the workplace, but as trying to play into, what people should believe rather than how they should behave, which are two very, very different things, then I think you run the risk of creating that kind of tension within the workplace. That means that You've got some people who are, massively on it and think it's the best thing and spending all their time talking about it and what you should be doing. And you've got a lot of people whose discretionary effort will just reduce because they'll think, oh God, you hear it a lot, and sometimes, this is justified and sometimes it's not justified, but people saying, I just don't feel I can say anything anymore. And some people will genuinely worry that they don't feel that they can say or contribute or what have you. Now, if you've created that environment, you're not going to have a productive workforce.
Yeah, because people aren't raising concerns because your critical thinkers have all shut up.
Because people aren't raising concerns, because people maybe just opt out of conversations, about a whole range of different things, not necessarily about EDI topics, but just, they just don't feel that they're included, which is exactly what you're trying to not make happen. But you do it by bad practice that essentially tries to control how people think and behave. Think rather than how they behave.
So, and then there are the people for whom it will get bad enough, or unpleasant enough, or just depressing enough that they'll actually leave. So that becomes a retention issue, and it may or may not be a grievance issue before they go or on their way out. And they might not tell you why they've left as well. They might. How honest are people always when they're leaving? I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, that just comes back to culture, doesn't it? You're trying to create a culture where people feel that they can come into work, do the best work that they can in a safe environment, in and around people, and then go home and have their life outside of work. And so if you're creating an environment where they don't feel that they can do that, and that can happen from a myriad of different reasons, including kind of racist environments and sexist environments as well. I'm not suggesting that, but if you don't create that, then you run the risk that people will opt out and look to find another organisation where they might be able to.
I'm wondering if there's also an impact on recruitment because employer brand is beginning to suffer. I've heard that certain brands, the way that they're behaving around some of the DEI issues, are actually putting people off from wanting to apply there if they don't want all that stuff as part of their daily life. So people like John Lewis, for example, who I think have made some pretty bold missteps in terms of misjudging the diversity of people who work within their organisation, particularly around women and trans. I think there are a lot of women now who are saying, I wouldn't want to work there because I really don't need all that. That's not my thing at all. And I've heard of people kind of thinking, I don't like being asked all these questions, when I'm applying for a job, all about my sexuality and all that. This just feels weird. I'm not into it. Why are there all these questions about my race? I'm going to apply somewhere else. So I wonder if there's a kind of employer branding and even in terms of the nuts and bolts of recruitment, what kind of vibe people are getting from an organisation while they're going through the recruitment process. For example, being asked for your pronouns in an interview could be enough to put some people off from wanting to work there. I don't know if that recruitment aspect has been considered really properly. I haven't heard anyone talk about that.
Yeah, I think, people consider a lot of different factors, don't they, when they're looking at where they go to work. And I suppose it depends on how much choice you have as an employee. So I think quite often when we talk about things, we're talking about semi-professional or professional people who can choose maybe a bigger range of organisations where they can go. And I do think, if it feels like there's a high-profile debate going on within an organisation, I could understand why that would put people off. If all you want to do is come in and do your work, get paid, feel like you've contributed, and go home and, like I say, live your life outside of work, which is where most people should and do live their lives, then I could see why that would put people off. I think, the point you make about data collection is tricky, right? Because more and more organisations are asked to report and to provide information on that data collection. And I think, that is a bit of a double-edged sword, because I do understand why some people then go, God, why are you asking me this? It's got nothing to do with it. But at the same time, if bad practice is unmeasured, not grounded in data, then you need the data and you need the measures in order to improve. So that is a bit tricky. But I think you're right. I think, if you were having a widespread trade union dispute, you probably think twice about going into an organisation. Similarly, if you've got a big kind of public bust up about a D&I topic, I could understand that would put people off as well.
Okay, so do you think, it sounds like you're saying that workplaces are becoming generally too politicised. Is that fair to say? And I wonder whether, in terms of the issues that are the sticking points, which are the kind of few that you're seeing being the ones that either are creating the most problems or you can't see a way around at the moment?
So I think, over a period of time, we've slipped from genuinely about trying to create good workplaces into social policy. This is, I think, one of the lines where, in general, a lot of organisations have overstepped. And when it becomes problematic, it seems to me, is when you get two groups who are potentially marginalised coming up against each other. So, we've seen that in terms of the conflict in Palestine. So you obviously, I will have employees who are Jewish and I will have employees who are related or are Palestinian. And so suddenly you've got these debates within an organisation which aren't about an established sort of majority, which a lot of the debates about diversity and inclusion have been about, how do you create something other than white middle class men? All of a sudden you've got these trade-offs, or the very high profile one has been the trans debate and trans rights versus women's rights. And I think, those most organisations aren't equipped to navigate those kinds of social policy discussions. They're super, super complex. And I think that's where the line has been overstepped, and people are now falling into these traps where they're struggling then to find a way out, because instead of it being we need more women and less men, which I don't think anybody would disagree with, you're then into a more problematic discussion. And as I say, one that I don't think most organisations are equipped to navigate.
I'm hearing a little voice in my head. Somebody might say, do we necessarily need more women in every situation? Do we therefore need more male beauticians? Are we trying to make everything 50-50? I don't know. That's just the devil's advocate. But I agree with you, but I'm just hearing people that won't in my ear.
No, I think that's a really, really important point. So what you're trying to do is not create, exactly 50-50 structures within every team. And that's why, measures like the gender pay gap aren't necessarily very effective. Occupational segregation is a really, really important factor that we need to look to try and correct over a period of time. It's not the sort of thing that you can easily do. So it's I think, it may be a flippant point, but it's actually it uncovers one of the things that says this is really detailed and it's really difficult. And, gender pay is different to equal pay, for example. So people conflate those two things. And it's exactly why we should be focused on the detail of our organisations rather than the social policy of making statements about things that actually, in many cases don't translate back into our work.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So really, it should be different for each organisation. Should have their own policy. Do you think everyone's just got a little bit this idea that everyone should have the same policy is sort of sneaked in from somewhere? There's like a DEI way of doing things.
Yeah, and I think you see this on a lot of areas in organisations where, corporates huddle together a little bit because there's safety in kind of, consistency. So you saw it with Black Lives Matter is a great example where lots of organisations where we need to come out and we need to make a statement and we need to do it because that organisation's done it and that organisation's done it. And they've not sat back and reflected and said, what is the statement that we genuinely feel we should be making? What is, reflective of our culture, our situation, our organisation? Instead, they kind of have a kind of safety in numbers sort of effect. But you also saw it, in kind of post-pandemic working arrangements. One of the reasons organisations got themselves in a pickle over this is they all rushed out to say, the future is you can work from wherever you want for whenever you want. And now they're trying to row back on that and they're having problems on it. Whereas if you just spent a bit of time going, what's right for my organisation? What do I need to do for my employees, for my customers, for my communities? That might give you a slightly different answer. And so it's something I think, unfortunately, you see in a lot of corporate behaviour.
Do you think it was a mistake for people to make statements about, to get into the habit of making statements about political things going on? I mean, it was probably started with the murder of George Floyd, didn't it? That was 2020, wasn't it? That was the first one I remember. And then we got into Ukraine, and then feels like people are being expected to make statements on Israel and Palestine, and this is obviously all getting a bit tricky. Do you think they should just never have got into this?
So I think if it's relevant to your organisation, then people might look to you to make a statement. If the thing that you're talking about is key to who you are or what you do, then I think it's right that you do. If it's not, I think you've got to be very careful, because you are coming out and stepping outside of, the kind of reach of why your organisation exists. And that's different to having an internal conversation about things. So, for example, the invasion of Ukraine or the conflict between Israel and Palestine, you can have a conversation internally that says, if you're feeling upset about these things, then here's the support we've got available for you. Here's what exists. Let's remind you that these things exist for everyone all the time anyway. That's a hugely positive thing. I don't see an issue with that. But when you go externally to make a statement, I think you've got to ask yourself, does that really reflect my organisation and what I do? And do people want me to have an opinion on that? Or am I doing it because I think I have to?
Okay, let's leave it there for today. We'll be back soon with the second part of this conversation. Thanks for listening.